Well, let's start with the big anniversary. The 13th of July 1985, Live Aid, 72,000 people inside Wembley Stadium in London, 1.9 billion people in 150 countries watching worldwide. What was your job on the day?
Well, my job was looking after the television presentation in between the acts. So I was taking a brief rest from real work in radio and working in television at the time on the dark side. And we had got what we used to call the Jimmy Hill box. It was the controller box that hung from the ceiling of Wembley Stadium, where the commentators used to sit for big matches. This is, of course, the old Wembley. And you used to have to scramble up these stairs, metal stairs, to get to it. And we had to bring guests up in between the bands to fill while, you know, we talked to them about this, that and the other and asked them to send money and so on. So my job was to corral these people and be, in effect, a sort of studio producer of the television stuff, the interstitial material, if you like, in between the bands.
And you were responsible for the intro, which wasn't as planned.
No, the introduction was an interesting time and possibly the scariest thing that I've ever had to do, because it was just literally seconds before the whole beginning sequence, which, as you can imagine, was fairly well kind of planned, that Mike Appleton, the exec producer, came on the headphones and said, the Prince and Princess of Wales haven't arrived yet. So can you start the show from the box?
So the original plan was?
The original plan was that Tommy Vance, who was on the stage, would say something, and then the Prince and Princess of Wales would arrive, and then Status Quo would play, and then we would speak. But for some reason, this couldn't happen, and so they said to us, look, you'll have to launch the show for the world. And so I remembered, I don't know why, that old two-way family favourite show that I grew up with, you know, in the 1950s on the radio.
Now, there'll be a lot of people listening to this in the United States.
Right.
Just explain what Two-Way Family Favourites is.
Two-Way Family Favourites was a show for servicemen and military people abroad serving the British Empire, old boy. And it was a way of them being able to send requests back to home and for family and friends at home to send requests to them. And it was presented partly from London and partly from Cologne in what was then West Germany, which was really at the centre of the kind of British Army of the Rhine, the army of post-war occupation in Germany. And they used to start the show every week. It was 12 o'clock in London, and they used to say, it's 12 noon in London, 1 o'clock in Germany, and at home and away it's time for Two-Way Family Favourites. And off would come the tune, you know. And so I just grabbed this pad on the day of Live Aid and wrote, it's 7 a.m. in Philadelphia, 12 noon in London, and around the world it's time for Live Aid. And I just gave it to Richard Skinner. And Skinner and I had known one another for quite a long while because we worked together at Radio 1. And I'd brought him into Whistle Test, the TV show I was doing, to do some bits and bobs. And he's a very skilled presenter, very calm, which was, my God, necessary, because we had some other presenters who would have utterly panicked. And I gave him this script, and within, seconds, they cued us. And so Richard said, there was a pause, and then Richard said, it's 7 a.m. in Philadelphia. And as he was starting to speak, the huge PA system came on, and you could feel the box that we were in rattling, and it was a huge shock to suddenly hear. You know what it's like as a broadcaster. You're used to hearing yourself in your headphones, but if there's the slightest delay, it's slightly off-putting, isn't it?
Yeah.
And there was poor old Richard hearing himself back with, it was only a millisecond delay, but it was a delay. But my word, what a trooper. He kept going.
It's 12 noon in London, 7 a.m. in Philadelphia, and around the world it's time for Live Aid.
A Status Quo came on and started up with Rocking All Over the World. I kid you not, Richard and I embraced and cried. We were all exhausted, and my word, it was really emotional.
Here we go. What a morning, we're hitting the road. Here we go. Rocking all over the world.
I have to say I've never cuddled Richard Skinner since and have no plans to do so. You know, a lot of crap is talked about how, we all got together and worked as a team and it was very smooth and all the rest of it. Well, no, it wasn't really. A lot of us didn't think it would happen. You know, I happened to be in the office when Bob Geldof rang up and said, we're thinking of doing this thing. And I pretty much said, well, chance to be a fine thing, Bob, I don't think you'll pull this off. And because I knew him from various things that I'd done in the past at the BBC, particularly at Radio 1, and I was very sceptical, not cynical, although I may have sounded it, but I was sceptical that they could pull it together. And because the story was, briefly, that Bob had gone to Tyne-Tees Television, where his then wife Paula worked, doing the famous TV show The Tube, and said to Malcolm Gary and the others, I'm going to do this big show. And Malcolm looked at the available resources and said, of course we'd love to help, but only the BBC has enough trucks and enough kit and enough engineers to put on a thing like this. So Bob came to the BBC with some reluctance, really. And I thought that the BBC would say, well, that's a nice idea, you bolshy Irishman, and pat him on the head and send him away. But in fact, and I've said this before, and I do still believe this, I think the unsung hero of Live Aid is Michael Grade, who went on to be, big cheese at at ITV and of course the BBC. And at the time, he was the director of television, so he was in charge of radio of BBC One and BBC Two, the two main TV channels. And it was Michael who said, this is a really good thing and we should clear all the schedules. And that was a big move, because you can imagine the BBC's got contracts with people, to take off a programme that you've already paid for or that you will have to pay for whenever, it is a costly and brave decision. And he not only took that decision, but entrusted BBC One prime time for hours on end to a bunch of people who basically could just about make a 40-minute show for BBC Two in the evening, which was the Al Grey Whistle Test team. And my God, it was hard to get it right. And of course, if you watch it back now, that's why so much of it is in fact shite. We just weren't good enough to do a lot of it well, and some of the TV coverage is just dreadful. I've since heard back quite a lot of the radio coverage, which I wasn't involved with, which is much better. There's no doubt that the radio boys had a much greater facility for it because they knew what they were doing. We'd never done a live show. We'd certainly never done anything remotely as challenging as this. So it was a bit odd to ask us to do it, but we soldiered on. You
say bits of it were shite, but it was BAFTA award-winning shite.
Well, I think
the BAFTA is the equivalent of the Oscar.
The BAFTA is the equivalent of the Oscar,
and you won one.
Well, I didn't personally win one. The team won one, and so we all got to troop up there and shake hands. I think we won it for ambition and scale, and because it was a defining moment in all sorts of things. I think nothing that big had been tried on the television. That's why it won that award. I happen to think that it was a defining moment culturally and certainly musically as well. But I think it won an award because it was big, certainly not because it was any good. If you ever get a chance to watch Andy Kershaw interviewing John Hurt, the actor, when he plainly doesn't know who the hell he is, that's one of the great highlights.
Kershaw doesn't know who John Hurt is. John Hurt doesn't know who Andy Kershaw.
Andy Kershaw doesn't know who John Hurt is.
Oh, because the other way round could be forgiven.
Yes, I'd definitely be forgiven.
You don't know what's going on, eh? I'm joined now. I know it's the norm in this box to be joined by lots of men in sheepskin coats who'll say it's all about 90 minutes and it was a 50-50 ball. I'm pleased to say on this occasion I'm joined by actor John Hurt, star in 1984 and lots of other films. Who are you most wanting to see here today?
Who would I most wanting to see?
You're a rock fan, aren't you? Hey, you're in the wrong place if you're not.
I love it, but it's on a day like today, it's not a matter of I want to see any particular band. I want to see them all.
Yeah? You're just here to soak up the whole event?
Yeah, the whole event. The whole event is such a huge event. There's never been an event like it in the world before, ever. And that's quite a big statement.
If I can suddenly turn you into a spokesman for the acting profession for a minute, as a famous actor, is there a feeling amongst actors to do something similar, to make a similar contribution to what the rock stars have done?
I think there
would be.
I think that the feeling amongst actors is that it's somewhat more, it's a little bit more hopeless insofar as that it doesn't have the popular, the popular backing that you get with a show like the show with bands. If you could be sure of being able to put a film together or something which was going to
profits from which you'll go to.
The only difficulty with films is you never know whether it's going to make any money anyway.
Right, I'm going to do it. I'll have to interrupt you, John, because I've got to say, about to take the stage is a man who's widely believed to be my brother, and I'd like to take this opportunity on worldwide television to deny this. Oh, I'm told we've got to hold it now. Oh, quick, this is coming on. Run VT.
Live aid from London with BBC TV and Radio 1.
There was a lot of that. People were being trooped up into the box and we were being told to interview them. And we had no time because there's no green room, there's no talk back. So we had no time to prepare the presenters. And anyway, they were under a phenomenal amount of pressure. You know, Kershaw had done a bit of Radio 1. David Hepworth, you know, he was an experienced presenter of a pre-recorded television show.
And short interviews.
Exactly. Yeah. And of course, was a great journalist, still is, you know, as was and is Mark Ellen, the other major presenter. But it was interesting that actually the best presenter on Live Aid was Mike Smith, who just had the chops, you know, he'd just done all that stuff. He'd done looking at the camera and then looking away. Exactly. He'd done live. He'd done listening to the talk back and watching the studio manager and talking to the camera. He had some skills that most of our people just didn't have and couldn't possibly have developed in the short time that they had. Unbelievable, really, that we got away with it.
We'll rejoin Mike Smith downstairs. Mike, are you there?
Thank you very much, and thank you to the double act from the other side as well. Now, I've got with me here Roger Taylor of Queen, who's come down from Wembley. We've seen so many bands come and go at Wembley this afternoon, again at Philadelphia this evening, and there's these band changeovers going on. How difficult is it getting all that equipment changed around?
Very. Well, you've seen lots of bands come and go, but you're not going to get rid of us that easily. Actually, it's very difficult because the sound, you just don't know what it's going to sound like, you know. And it sounded awful to us on stage, but the audience was just incredible.
They were great.
Wonderful.
Well, the Sunday papers are full of it. We'll maybe take a look at those before we go off the air today. But let's now just go back to Wembley this afternoon, because U2 did an absolutely stormer of a set, as did many other bands here this afternoon. But Paul Gambaccini caught up with Bono of U2 for an interview. Here they are.
Bono, great to see you after a dynamic show today. My question is, do you think this is a new era of responsibility for rock music?
Well, I suppose rock and roll music's shirked its responsibility for a long time. I don't know, I suppose it's a dual thing, isn't it? I mean, you've a private responsibility and then there's a public one. Like, this is a public thing, and I think there is time for that. But there's also, it must be private. So much of mine and other of the performers here, their lives is so public. And, you know, they would be private about giving or being generous. Like, I'm sure Bruce Springsteen or Prince or people who are not involved today are generous in a private way as opposed to a public way.
For you yourself, are you satisfied that this was indeed a good way for you two to show their commitment?
Yeah, I think this was the time, to be public about it. The thing that interests me, though, about this, and I don't know if this is the time or the place, but you see, it's the government's responsibility, ultimately. I don't mean I don't care whether Conservative, Labour or anything. It's the governments of our countries' responsibility to look after our money, because we give them money in tax. And it seems to be an either-or situation. Either they invest in life or they invest in death. And, for the cost of MX missiles or Star Wars or offensive defence budgets, we could turn those deserts in Africa into fertile land. I mean, the technology's with us. It is here, it's possible to do it. So what I hope is this, as a public thing, will affect public opinion, which ultimately will affect the politicians and the policymakers.
How did the relationship between the broadcaster and the viewer or the listener change after Live Aid?
Oh, that's a very good question. That's a very good question. I think answering that question in a roundabout way, I think we woke up the following morning thinking the world had changed. It's very odd, isn't it? Because the 1980s we now look back on as the era of loads of money and, Thatcher and Reagan and some pretty tough right-wing, there's no such thing as society kind of politics. And there, right in the middle of that decade, there's this moment where we think, you know what? Bob Dylan was right. The hippies were right. We, the younger generation, I mean, we're all 40 by then or 35 or something, but we, the younger generation, are going to change the world. We can stand up, we can say, you governments are useless, but we, chaps with long hair and guitars, we can feed the poor. And there was, I think, an idealistic moment at the end of Live Aid that made you think, we're finally in charge. We can do this. Now, in what way did that change broadcasting? Well, the BBC was complicit in that. The BBC allowed these, lunatics who'd taken over the asylum to go on the television and say, give us your money. I mean, he didn't actually say that, as you know.
Yeah.
But the implication is, I think what he actually said was, that, give us your money.
I think Spitting Image made him say
They did, yeah.
Mick and David did that video specifically so that you could give something, and it's not happening enough. You've got to get on the phone and take the money out of your pocket. Don't go to the pub tonight, please. Stay in and give us the money. There are people dying now, so give me the money. And here's the numbers.
Let's go through the way. We're probably going to get the address first, aren't we?
No, let's the address. Let's get the numbers, because that's how we're going to get it.
I think we're just, as we're doing this interview, we're just a few days away from the BBC's coverage of Glastonbury. And I think Glastonbury, which, is on the BBC because of a deal that I did when I was back in another job many, many years later. But the BBC as the national broadcaster goes to Glastonbury and it buys into the vibe of Glastonbury. It doesn't sit there saying, well, there's a lot of people here seem to be having a good time and they seem to be rather left-wing. They go along and they take part in it. And I think that was something that the BBC, prior to Live Aid, had never done. I think it had always commentated, but it had never in quite that way participated.
Is the BBC a changed organisation then because of that?
I wouldn't say it's only because of Live Aid, but yes, it's a changed organisation, my word, isn't it? In lots of very positive ways and a few not so positive, which we might discuss.
Do you want to discuss that now? Or
well, we
in what way then? The good and the bad?
I think the BBC now is much more responsive to its audience than it used to be. I think there was a real sense, certainly when I joined, that it was all rather good for you, BBC, and it was all made by people who were educated and probably lived in London, and there was a certain kind of top-down thinking, and some of that has gone away, and we're all the better for that. There is now an understanding at the BBC that it's funded by a universal poll tax called the licence fee, so it had better produce programmes for everybody. So there are programmes for, like on BBC Three, there are programmes for Spotty Herberts, and there's programmes for intellectuals, and there's programmes for all sorts of people. So I think in that sense, it's a very good thing. I think where the BBC has changed for the worst is that it's not as prone to taking risks. It's become a risk-averse organisation that wants to know how good somebody is before they put them on the air. It wants people to be proven talents in some other area before it takes a risk of putting them on. It would never do Live Aid now because, actually it might, because after years of Glastonbury, it's now got a team of people who know how to do that. But, I do think that the BBC now is less likely to say, oh, it, yeah, let's have a go, which I think, it really did feel it could, perhaps in those days.
Let's talk about you then. The first time I became aware of your name was in 1980. I'm 16. And my favourite radio programme was 25 Years of Rock.
Oh, Graham, you're the sweetest boy.
I listened to the first 3 or 4. Well, 25 Years of Rock was each week for an hour. You concentrated on a year, started in 1955, finishing 1979. You played the music, but also audio, usually from newsreels from the day. And I was fascinated with the 60s anyway. So I'd listened to the first few from 1955 onwards. And then I bought, every week I went to W.H. Smith's and bought a C120. So I could get the whole show on one side of the cassette without missing the bit when I turned the tape over.
Well, I'm going to have to make a citizen's arrest.
And so from 1960 up until the final one, I had every one. I'd collected them because that was the only, there was no listen again back then.
Not in those days, no.
I had every one. I think the first one in 1960, I think it starts with Kathy's Clown, Everly Brothers. I mean, it's certainly on there. I don't know, it starts with that. And it was a real education because all the big events were on there. The moon landing, the Kennedy assassinations, both of them, Martin Luther King, Oswald, and it was the real audio from the events. And I absolutely loved it. And I also loved that you used Oh Well, Fleetwood Mac, as the play-out music. And at the end of it, it said, and 25 Years of Rock is produced by Trevor Dann. So every week I heard this name.
25 Years of Rock was researched by Pete Frame and John Tobler and produced by Trevor Dann. The series was devised by Stuart Grundy and is a Radio 1 production in association with Billboard magazine.
Do you know, I met somebody just a few weeks ago who's now working as an exec with the commissioning team at Radio 4. And I arrived for this meeting and I was sat sort of in the comfy area, and she came over, she was called Sharon, and she came over and she said, "Hello, are you Trevor Dann?" And I said, "Yes." She said, "Oh, I felt like a pop star." She said, "Your programme 25 Years of Rock is what got me into radio. It's what made me start listening to the radio." And it was a moment when there are very few moments, are there, in radio, you know this, where you genuinely feel, okay, well, I did something that people appreciated. A lot of what we turn out is just twaddle to fill the time. But when somebody bothers to say, "I really appreciated your work," that's a fantastic thing.
As the miller told his tale, face at first just ghostly, turn the wider shade of pale.
Black America is continuing its long, hot summer. Just days after the rioting in Newark, New Jersey, mob violence has broken out in the Motor City, Detroit. Dozens of people have already been killed, and federal troops have been ordered in to restore calm.
The great manufacturing city that exports cars all over the world was in the grip of mad destruction. So were many other American towns. Harlem, New York's Negro quarter, began to emulate Detroit. Rioting here is no new thing, but New York's police feared that this one might dwarf anything known before. All over the country, law-abiding people looked to the president for a lead. But Washington was a long way away. For the moment, it was a battle, authority against crime on the rampage.
Law and order have broken down in Detroit, Michigan. Pillage, looting, murder, and arson have nothing to do with civil rights. They are criminal conduct, and the federal government, in the circumstances here presented, had no alternative but to respond, since it was called upon by the governor of the state, and since it was presented with proof of his inability to restore order in Michigan.
We have to understand violence is necessary because America made it necessary. Violence is a part of America's culture. Violence is as American as cherry pie.
You know that it would be untrue. You know that I would be a liar if I was to say to you, girl, we couldn't get much higher. Come on, baby, light my fire. Come on, baby, light my fire. Try to set the night on fire. The time to hesitate is through. No time to wallow in the mire. Try now, we can only lose, and our love become a funeral pyre. Come on, baby, light my fire. Come on, baby, light my fire. Try to set the night on fire.
Oakland, California, where demonstrators against the Vietnam War tried to close the Army Induction Center. 91 were arrested when some of them tried to block the entrances. Some 240 people were jailed within 4 days of demonstrations in a week of nationwide protests, which ended with a giant rally in Washington. Police moved in quickly to carry off the sit-down protesters. President Johnson denounced the irresponsible acts of violence and declared that American policy in Vietnam would not be changed.
I believe that many people in the United States believe that the war in Vietnam is a stalemate. And I would like to assure you that it's not a stalemate at all. And we are winning the war militarily.
I would expect the percentage rate of American casualties to go down in '67. I would expect the conventional military war to achieve very sensational results in '67.
Al Capone, guns don't argue.
It really was it was like an ultimate advert for radio, because it was the music and you'd blended the music to fit the stories. Usually, you know, the Vietnam stuff it was also the actuality from these amazing events in history. It really was.
Well, there was an executive producer on Radio 1 whose name was Stuart Grundy. And Stuart, whose son Julian is now a commissioning exec at Radio 2, Stuart used to go on air quite a lot. He had a very good voice, very plumby voice. And he was my boss. And he had developed this idea of making the story of popular music with some clips from the year in question. And he did a deal with Billboard magazine in the United States. The idea being that this would be a Radio 1 show that would be full of American material, so it would be broadcast in America. And also, Billboard would be able to supply some clips because they would know people who collected archive material. So a producer was allocated to this, and they made a pilot. And Stuart was the presenter throughout, so it had links. That was Cathy's Clown, and meanwhile, the Cuban Missile Crisis was going, that kind of thing. And for some reason, I heard this, and I listened to it, and I thought, this is absolutely terrible. And I want to do it. So I went to see Derek Chinnery, who's the presenter, the controller of Radio 1, and I said, Derek, I know this sounds utterly pompous, but I could do this a lot better, because I actually, I did do history at university and stuff, and my big idea is, I don't think you need Stuart. I think what you need is to get rid of the presenter altogether. I think I'd just learnt a new word, which was disintermediated.
Wow.
And I probably said at the time, what we need, Derek, is a disintermediated melange of the music and the archive. So he called Stuart in and said, I think Trevor's right. I think he should do it. And Stuart said, well, that's fine, as long as I'm still called the producer. And I said, if you're still called the producer, matey, I'm not doing it. So we ended up with that ludicrous credit, which was 25 Years of Rock, devised.
Right, okay, yeah.
Which I nicked from Desert Island Discs.
Okay.
It was devised by Roy Plumley. So it was devised by Stuart Grundy and produced by Trevor Dann. And it set, so as you know, we then kind of revisited it all those years later and called it Sounds of the 20th Century, and we remade the original 25 and then made 25 more.
When you did the originals, though, this was pre-YouTube, pre-digital. It must have been, you must have been manually editing with blades and...
all that, yeah. Well, Brian Thompson, who is still with us, still working freelance as a studio manager, he was one of the great geniuses, really, in all this technically. But we had to make everything on tape on those huge, great Studer machines. We all of 25 Years of Rock was made in a studio called Langham 1, which is now one of the downstairs bars in the Langham Hotel opposite Broadcasting House in London. But before it became the Langham Hotel, it was owned, or at least rented, by the BBC, and it had studios in it. In fact, the famous Jimi Hendrix session, where he sings the Radio 1 jingle, that was recorded in Langham 1. It was a pucker BBC studio, but of course it was enormous.
Radio 1, you're the only one for me.
So if you wanted to play in a record and 2 bits of tape or 3 bits of tape, you had to have arms 20 foot long. And we learnt not so much mixing as gymnastics, Brian and I, by leaping.
On a multi-track?
No, it was all mixed. No, it was not mixed on a multi-track. So if something went wrong, you had to go right back to the beginning. Wow. So I would go in there and say, look, I've got this idea for the script, and it's, I don't know, it was one I can particularly remember, which was, we'll start with The Kinks, You Really Got Me, and then when it gets to the middle, we'll fade it down and we'll put this bit of archive in over it, and while it's playing, we'll segue into All Day and All of the Night, which is in the same key, and we'll come back and there'll be this kind of Kinks sandwich thing going on. And of course, then you start listening to them and you go, you know what? A bit like Strawberry Fields Forever. It'd be much better if we just slow All Day and All the Night down ever so slightly. Let's just drop that, and then it'll sound much more, it'll just fit together better. Well, those are great and easy now, creative ideas, but when you've got to physically do them with mechanical devices, the whole thing is very different. We used to make loops of sound where we would physically make a loop of tape and run it round 2 different machines, so that you could get enough of a loop so that you didn't hear the same sound coming around too often. So, it was very different from, making sounds of the 20th century, which, I pretty well made on my laptop.
Yeah. I had no idea. I assumed it was all done on a multi-track.
No.
So it's the Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band of Radio.
We did, rather like them. We did do a lot of bouncing. You know, we'd say, well, let's make this sequence where we have that archive, that newsreel, that piece of music, and then we'll bounce that down, and then we'll run this other thing underneath, and off we go. You know, there was a lot of stuff that could and did go wrong. Because, you know, actually, the most interesting thing, you'll know this from making shows, you make the thing, and you've timed it all to perfection, and you know it has to be 59 minutes 30 long or whatever it is, and you finish it, and bloody hell, it's 59:20. You know, how are you going to stretch it? Or it's, you know, it's 60:05, but it ends with a really good moment. And oh dear. So a lot of the time was taken in speeding bits up to make them fit, or having to chop bits out when the music wasn't playing. And oh dear, I go cold thinking about it after all these years.
Well, let's go back to the beginning then. You grew up in Nottingham.
I did.
Which is a provincial town, probably what?
How dare you? It's God's own city.
I'm sorry, what? 150 miles from London, 200 miles? Not quite.
It's about 120 miles from London, in the Midlands, the East Midlands.
It's definitely not London, though.
It is not London.
What kind of a kid were you?
Arrogant.
You were an only child, though.
I was an only child.
So the radio would have been important.
The radio was huge for me because I grew up in a house with no books in it and no television apart from BBC until I was, I think, 14. So I never saw Ready, Steady, Go or those, you know, famous 1960s TV shows because my mother wouldn't have that kind of thing in the house. And we were not a creative or artistic family. You know, we didn't go to the theatre. I'd never been to the theatre till, I don't know, I was 17.
You didn't go to Panto as a kid?
Not that I remember, no. I think I might have been taken, actually, to see Nina and Frederick in concert.
Down the way where the nights are gay and the sun shines daily on the mountain top, I took a trip on a sailing ship, and when I reached Jamaica I made a stop. But I'm sad to say I'm on my way, won't be back for many a day. Me heart is down, me head is turning around, I had to leave a little girl in Kingston Town.
And your parents ran a shop?
They ran a shop in a place called West Bridgeford in the suburbs of Nottingham. You know, and they're decent people. I don't want to diss them. They did their best, but they were not cultured. You know, they thought of the ladies' evening at the Rotary Club as being the height of you know, social life. And the radio was my thing because that was where I went off. They gave me the use of an old Vidor portable radio, which looked like a suitcase, and you had to open the lid to make it work. And that was, you know, that was the way I went through the rabbit hole. You know, that was where I could depart from this, you know, pretty constrained council house life in Nottingham. We did buy a house when I was about 11, I think. So it was a bit different, but no, the radio was where it was at for me. And interestingly enough, I think not just music radio. I mean, there wasn't so much as there is now. But even when Radio 1 started, I used to wake up and listen to the Radio 4 Today programme every morning, even when I was 17, 18. Because I was much more interested in what was going on than I was in just hearing the same records over and over again. The radio shows I liked were Kenny Everett and John Peel and those kind of guys who were doing something a bit different rather than, you know, just churning out the hits.
Welcome to the fastest record show on record. Hi folks, welcome to the fastest record show today. We play more records here than any other DJ. With a record here, a record there, flaming records everywhere. Sit back 'cause we're starting right away. Yes, kids, hold tight to your trannies as off we go. Yes, friends, the first record in today's show is a noisy, raving steamer from Mack the Hoople.
Did you have a tape recorder?
I did. I was given a tape recorder for passing the 11 plus, which was a big exam in the UK at the time. At that point, it would be 1963. You passed the 11 plus and you went to the grammar school, or you failed it and you went to the secondary modern school, and that was a real cut-off, you know, in terms of your education. And I was very, very lucky, because in those days, the Nottinghamshire County Council, run by a Labour administration, which is an important fact. I'm not turning into a Corbynista here, but it is important. They had decided that the top 12 people who passed the 11 plus would be offered scholarships to Nottingham High School, which was the big school in town where basically rich kids went, but it was one of the top public schools in the country. And I was fortunate enough to be in that number, so I got the scholarship. So I went off to, you know, swanky school in the middle of town.
And got the tape recorder?
And got the tape recorder as a present.
And what were you recording on it?
I recorded, it was an old telephone, in fact I've still got it, it's out in the garage now, it still works. It won't play anything like the right speed, of course, but I used to record Pick of the Pops every week.
Yeah.
Obviously taking, you know, pressing the pause button during the links, the whole thing. But of course I used to do that. And then later on, I would record, you know, Where It's At with Kenny Everett and Chris Denning, and obviously the John Peel show, Top Gear as it was when it started. Anything with music, but also I recorded I'm Sorry, I'll Read That Again,
right,
a comedy show of the time. And, you know, I round the horn, actually, I loved all. I was talking to Danny Baker about this when I interviewed him. We both loved all that stuff, and he never heard it on the radio. He was listening to all that stuff off gramophone records.
Right.
But that was one of the things that I do remember hearing on the radio in a communal way at home in the 50s and early 60s. It would be after Two-Way Family Favourites, which we just talked about, there was always an hour of comedy afterwards, and so you'd get Round the Horn or the Navy Lark and those kind of things, which were also quite influential, as was Jack Jackson, who used to put comedy stuff in between records, because they did just shine a light on the fact that you could do more with this radio art form than just play records or just read the news. There was a way of kind of blending things, and I don't know, maybe that's where it all started for me.
Hello there, record lovers everywhere, and welcome to the show.
Oh, gold gramophone records.
Look, there's still time for you to leave if you want to. I mean, I don't mind holding up for a few moments if it means that those skinny little legs of yours will carry that dirty little carcass upstairs.
Stop in here.
All right, then, sit down and shut up. Now, sir, you were saying?
See, my agent's only got to say we're off again, and I can't wait to get out the suitcases and trunks on it.
Why?
I like the packing.
He likes the packing. Ah, madam, I can see that you are gastronomically inclined.
I thought, well...
Well, I mean, where do you and your boyfriend go out to eat?
Well, of course, Johnny and I always like to go to the right place for the right thing. Hamburg. Oh, indeed we do. Hamburg. Oh, I'm so glad you're with me. Hamburg for the hamburgers, Brussels for the sprouts, Vienna for the steaks, Cannes for the baked beans, Greece, my dears, for the fish and chips, Stockholm for the stock, Greenland for the green.
Now, where'd you end up?
Windermere.
So, you're 11, a teacher asks you what you wanted to do when you left school. What did you tell him?
Oh, well, I always said I wanted to work on the radio. You see,
always?
I just always did.
Yeah.
It was the only thing I could ever think that I could do. I mean, obviously, I'm sure I wanted to be a pilot or a railway driver at some point. But realistically, that was the thing that I always wanted. I couldn't really conceive of doing anything else. And it was the radio, not the telly. Mm-hmm. And it was interesting, when I went to work in the telly, I was no good at it. I did make some shows that did quite well, but I never really had any feel for it. It was all too... It wasn't direct enough for me. It was all too much faffing about, and there's a hair in the gate. Oh, can we take that again? It's not my best side. It wasn't for me, telly. But the radio, possibly because of the only child thing, that was the direct. You have an idea, somebody hears it immediately. That stuff was I found captivating.
You go to Cambridge University, which is one of the top universities in the world, in the country. For anyone in America who's listening and doesn't understand, it's like Harvard and Yale, it's Oxford and Cambridge. You go there, and then you get your first radio job. How did you get your first radio job?
Well, I should have had the balls to apply for a BBC general entrant scheme, but I didn't. To be absolutely honest with you, I didn't even know about it.
Because with Cambridge University on the CV, if we had CVs back then, or whatever it was, a letter of introduction or whatever.
There's a chance I could have got that kind of thing, and I didn't do Footlights, where, a lot of people start doing comedy and music. So I don't know, perhaps I was shy or just not ambitious enough, I don't know. I went for a careers conversation with a very irritating man who I can see in my mind's eye to this day. I can see the red bulging neck and the sorry, I banged the microphone now, I'm so angry with him, and the too tight collar and the very small tie. And he said to me, well, frankly, Trevor, I should forget the BBC, with an accent like yours, no chance. And I didn't have the guts to say, well, wait a minute, the broadcasting is now full of people like Michael Parkinson who don't speak as though they come from Surrey. So can you... anyway, he pretty much put me off. So
even though he knew nothing about broadcasting,
he was telling me, and I do feel bad about this. I just feel that I should have had more courage to push myself at the BBC, to even apply for a job. So what I did was I went back home to Nottingham, and in the Easter holidays of what would be my final year, 1974, I went into BBC Radio Nottingham.
The local station that just covers...
The local station. It had been going for about 6 years at that point. And I walked in and said to the receptionist, Alison, hello, I'm just wondering if you've got any jobs and how you applied to this place. And she said, oh, well, I'll take some details. Now, I suspect they hadn't seen anybody who looked like me at Radio Nottingham because I had very long hair and these stupid mutton chop sideboards, and I was wearing a floral shirt and real bell-bottom flares and platform heels. And so I must have looked a complete sight. I must have looked like a member of Shawaddy Waddy, although in my head I looked really cool. But as it happened, there's a man standing behind her who introduced himself. He said, oh, hello, I'm Tom Beasley. I'm the station manager. Have you got a minute now? And I looked at him and said, yes, of course. So the next thing I know, quite genuinely, I'm sitting in the manager's office. And he's saying, well, very interesting to hear what you've been doing. And, what's your history in radio? I said, well, I haven't really got one, but I did run the tape recording society at Nottingham High School and blah, blah, blah. So he said, if you're interested in work, would you come in next week and talk to 2 other people? So I went back and saw Tony Church and John Bright, both no longer with us, and did the interview. And as I was walking back down the stairs, Tony Church ran after me and said, you'll definitely get the job, by the way. That was terrific. Please come and work for me. And so I went back to university and I got a letter from the BBC saying, would you like to start on whatever date it was? And I had to write back and say, well, I can't because I've got to do my finals. I've got to actually do some exams. But I did my final exam on the Friday, early June, and then I started on the Monday at BBC Radio Nottingham.
Now, how were your parents with that? Because, you know, what? They think that you'd thrown away a Cambridge education.
Yeah, they truly did. They thought it was an absolute waste. I'd done really well at school and got really good A-levels, and I'd gone to, as you say, one of the best universities in the world. And I should have, in their mind, I should have been going off to be a lawyer, or I don't know, some kind. Well, you look at some of the people who went to my school. Kenneth Clark was just a bit older than me. Ed Balls just a bit younger.
All cabinet ministers.
Exactly. Yeah. They thought, what the hell is he doing? Pissing around, smoking long luxury cigarettes and listening to these terrible bands, and then going on the BBC and talking about them, which is pretty much what I did. And but only in the Nottingham area. They thought it was a dreadful waste. And my father, I think, who's many years dead now, was always pretty much disappointed with me until I got a big job at the BBC when I was in my 40s. And then he really turned. And
so they did come round eventually?
They did come round. I don't think my mother has ever come round. I mean, she's got serious dementia now, so she doesn't know what I do. But she always was terribly dismissive of what I did. She thought it was, cheap and just peddling crap, really.
Up until this point, you'd been a radio fan. Now, instead of being a consumer of radio, you're a producer of radio. How steep a learning curve was there?
Well, I don't think I thought I needed to learn very much. You see, and I'm being very honest with you here. I didn't think that producing radio was difficult. I just thought it was asking people to make shows I'd like. And I'm not sure, even at the age of 65, I look back on that as being wrong. I really do think that a lot of what drives you to make good radio is to make things that you like. And all the best shows I've ever made have been ones that I thought were pretty good for myself. And all the worst shows I've made have been ones where I've worked to a template arranged by somebody else. Those shows you have to do where they go, well, do this there and play that there. And I get kind of snotty with that anyway, because I'm not very good at being told what to do. But I don't think it brings out the best in me, really. I don't think it makes me put in the hours. So really, when I went to start producing, particularly at Radio 1 in the early 80s, I just thought of my role as asking presenters to be a bit more communicative with people who were coming from Nottingham and other places.
Outside London.
Yeah, and not just making shows for record pluggers, which it seemed to me was very prevalent. And I think you still hear a lot of this on Radio 1 and 2, and particularly Six Music. You hear this, and now we've got an exclusive cut from something that's just been dropped by a band you've never heard of. Or that kind of searching for a superiority over your consumer by saying, I'm rather better than you because I've managed to go to this gig and I've managed to get hold of this acetate as it was in our day, or this file that's been dropped for me.
And that's not how you discover music. You discover music because a cool friend or an uncle or an older brother or someone's friend goes, have you got to hear this?
Yeah.
You've got to that does seem to be missing now and again from introducing you to music. It needs to be that
truly is.
way.
And do you know what? That person who puts his arm around you and says, come and listen to this, is not always introducing you to a record that was made in Bradford yesterday. He's often saying, have you ever heard of Hank Williams?
Yeah.
Or you probably don't remember Frank Sinatra, but this is good. Or I don't know. Nowadays it would be really uncool to go on Radio 2 and say, God, I've always loved Thin Lizzy. But why not?
Yeah.
Whereas you have to pretend that actually Snow Patrol are a bit kind of yesterday. I don't get this striving for novelty for its own sake. And I mentioned Glastonbury earlier. What is the story of Glastonbury this year? It's not Spotty Herberts you've never heard of. It's Barry Gibb, for God's sake.
Yeah.
It's Jeremy Corbyn.
Yeah.
It's old people.
Nile Rodgers. Yeah.
Exactly. No,
Yeah.
people who were making records 40 years ago, but whose music has lasted and is still being discovered by new people. That's the key thing to it. I don't think the generation of people who are now in their 20s are as ill-disposed towards old music as we were.
Yeah.
And the current, people in charge of music radio would seem to be.
So you moved to Radio 1. To explain, Radio 1 is a national pop music station. At the time you went there, it was dominant. I mean, audiences...
20 million listeners.
Yeah, 20 million listeners was not unheard of. Yeah, so what kind of an experience was it for a kid from Nottingham who got some experience in local radio? What was it like when you go? What was the culture of the place?
Well, it was horrible. It was absolutely appalling. It was run by a bunch of people whose experience of show business had been from working either during the war or when they were doing national service in the military in the 50s, working in ENSA, that kind of Butlins red coat, wahey, hello Da Nang kind of vibe. A lot of them understood show business in an old-fashioned way.
Light entertainment.
And they didn't approve of heavy entertainment, which is much more what people like Peel were conveying.
Yeah.
I remember somebody saying to me, I think it was Jim Moyer, actually, later head of Radio 2, talking about light entertainment on the television and complaining about some show and saying, look, this is light entertainment, not dark entertainment. Turn the bloody lights up. Make the floor shinier. No, it was... Radio 1 was determinedly trivial. It did not want to talk about anything that mattered to anybody. It was just fun with a capital F. And it was a load of old bollocks.
This is it. Isn't it beautiful? Morning, lad. Yes. Goodbye. What do you mean goodbye? You're not getting rid of me that quick, sunshine? Bit. Ah, how dare you? I'll tell you what I want you to do. Avoid it on the pavement and BBC carpet. I have been listening to Radio 1 for 3 hours. Yes. And I haven't heard a good film title yet. Well... So would you just, for a moment, I'll give you 10 seconds while you bone up on a good film title, okay? All right, I've got that. Good film title... Oh, go on! Underselling, as always, 275-285 brings you Daily Travis with a great film title. I can't find one. No, it's a film and television thing. It's what do you get if you cross Humphrey Bogart with the Terry Wogan quiz show? And the answer is... Don't mention that! The answer is... What are you doing? They've drifted away already. What do you get if you cross Humphrey Bogart with Terry Wogan's quiz show? It's Casablanca-de Blanc.
It was particularly bad because when I got there, and it was even worse in the 90s when I went back, I have to say, but in the late 70s, early 80s, it was largely populated by people in their 40s making programmes for people in their teenage years. And they had no instinctive understanding of what had changed since they'd been teenagers. So it was really hard, working with people like Dave Lee Travis and Tony Blackburn, big legends of radio. I found very hard because I couldn't get them to talk to the audience that was younger than them. They only really wanted to talk to the audience that had grown up with them.
It is odd, isn't it, that, you know, they got into radio with the old pirate ships in the mid-60s, and by the 90s, some of them were still on the air. It would be, to use an American equivalent, it would be like having, in 1995, it would be like having Murray the K on Z100 and expecting him to connect.
That is a very, very good example. You know, and of course, there's a place, even in America, there's a place for Casey Kasem to go on as he did until he was 150. But if you're running a public service radio station, which is what Radio 1 is, funded by a licence fee payer, you have an obligation to broadcast to people who are uniquely targetable by you, because it's not about selling advertising. So you can leave that. You can leave, just recycling the top 40. You leave that to plenty of other stations who have got to sell advertising. But you have an obligation to do something more. And I felt that the Radio 1 that I joined in 79 was not doing that, except at the margins where it did allow things like 25 Years of Rock to happen. Mm-hmm. And it did have the John Peel show and Bob Harris. And, I'm not saying nothing it ever did was any good, but it was an uncreative experience for me. And I can remember sitting on the stairs on my way to go off for another week of producing DLT in Flood of Tears, just thinking, there's got to be more to life than this. I have told Dave that, by the way.
Is he okay with it?
He's okay with it, yeah. Mind you, he's had a worse life than I have in the past 10 years. So
was that why you decided to leave Radio 1 and go to
telly?
Or you went to telly from there?
I went to telly from there.
And that was Whistle Test?
That was Whistle Test.
Old Grey Whistle Test was a very credible music show.
It was the only place in the 70s, before I worked on it, where you could actually see Bob Marley play live, David Bowie played live, The Who played live, great bands crammed into a little studio in Television Centre called Pres B. If I tell you that Pres A is where they did the weather forecast, you'll have some idea of the dimensions of this studio. And one of the reasons why those old films of Whistle Test in the 70s look so great is because the studio's so tiny that the bands are really standing very close together. You know that famous clip of David Bowie with Mick Ronson?
Yeah.
And the entire band are in the shot all the time because they can't get away from each other. It's very intimate and very good for that reason, I think.
Always down on the street, so I throw both his bags down the hall. I'm phoning a cab, 'cause my stomach feels small. There's a taste in my mouth, but it don't taste at all. Well, it could have been me, yes, it could have been me. What didn't I say? What didn't I say? She's so sissy and a silent and tight, in a frock coat, a bibbidi-bobbidi hat. Oh, God, I could do better than that.
By the time I'd got there, we'd moved into bigger studios, and I don't think we were as good. But I went there to do 25 Years of Rock on the telly, and then realised
Rock and Roll
that you
Years.
couldn't do, it became the Rock and Roll Years. That's the title they gave it. But it's impossible to do on the telly because you don't have all the pictures.
Yeah, and telly needs pictures.
It needs pictures. And so they would say to me, right, okay, well, we're going to do 1964. Now, we haven't got the Kinks doing You Really Got Me from 1964, but we have got them on German television in 1968. And I'd say, well, you can't use that then. They said, oh, that's fine.
Right.
And I just thought, no, this has all got to be true. It's got to be contemporaneous, this stuff. There's a certain amount of judgment after the fact that's going on in the decision of, well, we'll use this and we won't use that. But you can't distort the historical experience. This idea is meant to be a time machine.
Yeah.
We'll jump in the time machine, shut the door, and suddenly for the next hour it's 1960 whatever, 1970 whatever. And they were prepared to play with that. And I thought, no, I'm not going to do that. And as it happened, Whistle Test had a vacancy. So I put in for that and got it, which was very fortunate for me.
Well, that ended up being, you got the Live Aid.
That's why Live Aid happened for me, yeah.
After that, then GLR, Great London Radio?
Yes, then...
local station for London?
Local station for London. It had been Radio London. It had done quite badly compared to BBC stations elsewhere in the country. And there's a lot of reasons for that. It's really hard to do local radio for London because arguably Radio 4 is local radio for London. But anyway, Matthew Bannister, who I'd worked with at Radio Nottingham, came to me and said, look, I'm going to put in for this manager's job. Why don't we go together? And I'll be the manager and do the sort of news stuff, and you can pick the records. And I thought that'd be so exciting. Which indeed it was, yeah. And we both applied, and we both got the jobs, and we set off, and we designed. I would say this, wouldn't I? But it was a really good radio station. It was unique in the way it mixed the news and the music. There's a theme developing
rock
here,
and roll
and rock and rolling news.
Right.
Who thought of that? God, the shame, the indignity. How did we get away with that? We didn't get away with that.
But with personality too, though.
Yeah.
And big personalities.
We brought in comparatively famous people like Johnny Walker and Tommy Vance. And
were radio presenters through and through.
Exactly. We mixed it with people like Chris Evans and Emma Freud, who, nobody knew really, but had a certain amount of, we thought, authenticity and ingenuity. They were inventive and different. And, I'm very proud of GLR. And I think that was, I suspect that BBC Six Music would not sound like it does if it hadn't been for GLR. And I also think the same could be said of 5 Live. Mm-hmm. I think a lot of what we did with GLR just pointed the way to the some of it we just took from America. It sounds ridiculous, but this is true. We were the first radio station ever to get newscasters, newsreaders to say "I'm."
Okay.
So 12 o'clock, I'm Graham Mack.
Right.
No one ever said that in England before that.
Right, it was all too formal.
Yeah, and and there were little things, like we did 2020 travel, and it wasn't groundbreaking, but it was different.
Of course, the tricky thing about condoms is how to put one on. Well, in a brief, generous burst of public service radio, I could show you how. If only I could find something to demonstrate with. This microphone will do. OK, right, all you do is you put it on the end, squeeze out the air from the top, and then slowly roll down the full length, making sure that you've gone down as far as possible and the condom is securely in position. So, will London's fun-loving condom buyers be flocking to Condomania? Hello?
GLR. John in Hazelmere wanted to know how much it costs to run GLR.
Your licence fee costs you £77 a year. 2% of the whole lot goes to fund your local radio station, whatever it is, which is £1.54 a year. Or if you want it another way, it's 0.004p a day.
I'd say we were a bargain,
I'd
Trevor.
say that was a bargain, wouldn't you?
This is GLR 94.9. The greatest music, the latest news for London.
It just felt a bit more kind of free-form than a lot of
people
stuff that
still
had gone
talk
before.
about it today. I came back to the UK in '97, so I missed it all, but people at 2CR in Bournemouth, where I was working, would talk about GLR.
It's fun, isn't it? Yeah.
But if you measure its success by ratings...
Oh, it was hopeless. Absolutely, it was a total and abject failure. And this is why I could never hold down a job in commercial radio, because I have no idea how to win audiences. Absolutely none. Never give me a job. They didn't. Actually, they did briefly, but then I left. No, we were told... Now, what were the figures? We were told that BBC London, as it had been, had a reach of 10%. They wanted it to double. And after 3 years, we managed to halve it.
Okay.
And on the back of that distinguished performance, both Matthew and I got swanky new jobs at the BBC. So what does that tell you?
I hate to say it, for failure.
For failure.
Yeah. But you were doing something different enough. And by that stage, Radio 1, by all accounts, had got even worse at being out of touch with its audience.
Oh, completely.
It was out of touch with its audience in the 80s. By the 90s, it was severely out, because it still had the same presentation
Hopeless.
team.
Yeah, hopeless. And what we were... I mean, it was obvious, if you think about it, that we were going to cut the audience to Radio London down, because we went on air saying, you know, this is music for 25 to 45-year-olds. So this is music for people who've got a stake in the community and are too old for Radio 1. So Radio 1 was playing Kylie and Jason, and we were playing Michael Jackson and Bruce Springsteen. That was the sort of basic idea. And we're coupling it up with some intelligent conversation about stuff that people might care about. But that was a niche market we were going for. Having said that, when Matthew had left and I was briefly the managing editor for a couple of years, my Saturday morning schedule was Danny Baker, followed by Chris Evans, followed by Chris Morris. So I wonder how much you'd have to pay to get that on
lineup
the radio
now.
station now.
Yeah, well, you couldn't afford it.
Yeah.
But you ended up Radio 1, and this has been well documented, with Matthew Bannister. Which newspaper was it called? You Dann Dann The Hatchet-man?
I think it was The Star.
And why was that?
That was because I think it was Nicky Campbell actually who gave them that story, but I could be wrong. I don't think I am. No, what happened was Matthew had sacked a lot of presenters, or they'd walked out, because he'd been sent in there basically by John Burt, who was the Director General. And Burt had said, we've got to get rid of Johnny Beerling and that generation, and I want you, Matthew, who had left GLR and become a wonk. He was a policy strategist, and he'd written the great BBC thing called Extending Choice, which is about what is the BBC's job in the future under this new kind of John Burt regime. And so John put Matthew into Radio 1 to make it young.
Yeah.
And so he had got rid of a lot of presenters, and my job when I arrived, because I was in charge of the in-house production staff, was to pretty well mirror that with the producers, many of whom were my old colleagues from when I'd been there, and they were all older than me then. So by now, 1995, it was just insane. And this is not to say that old people are not creative, and I absolutely do want to emphasise this. And I do think that, we're seeing at the moment in, from Bernie Clifton to Vince Cable to Jeremy Corbyn, the Revenge of the Wrinklies. We're back, guys. But at that time, there wasn't that they were old in years; they were old in outlook, and they had to be gone. And so
you were the man to get rid of them.
Well, I had to find a way of abolishing various grades so that they could be made redundant.
So this wasn't purely a cost-saving thing?
No, it was not a cost-saving. I mean, there was some cost-saving.
Yeah.
But that was largely through making all the DJs self-op.
Yeah.
Because
they weren't. They were being.
Prior to that, they had self-op studios, but they also had a TO, as they were called, a technical operator, on the other side of the glass. And we put them into real self-op studios, and that was where most of that happened. But no, what we did was we got rid of what were called executive producers, and that meant we could release some funds to bring in another new category, which I think, again, became standard BBC practice, but we were the first to do it, and we called them broadcast assistants, BAs.
Yeah.
And in that intake came Ben Cooper, who went on to be controller, Rhys Hughes, who went on to be whatever his job title was, but effectively deputy controller, and various other bright, creative young people who then turned the station round. And the best headline we ever got was when the NME, I think in 1996, wrote a headline that said, Radio 1 no longer crap shock.
Right, that was the good one.
That was the good one.
But you got bad headlines when you banned Status Quo.
Yeah.
You also banned the Beatles.
We never banned the Beatles, Graham, but I I'm happy to go along. No, the story was with that, it's very simple. I was in charge of the music policy, and every week the new records would come in and we'd have a playlist meeting. And it wasn't Free as a Bird, the first of those remade John Lennon
There was
cassette
Free as a Bird
tapes.
and Real Love.
Real
were the two
Love.
songs, yeah.
It was Real Love came out, and I yield to no man in my affection and love for the Beatles, but that is not a great record. But even if it was a great record, was it a signature record for a station that was trying to say, we're now for young people? Was it the right kind of record to be playing when we were aiming for 15 to 24s? And I argued that it wasn't. So the same thing happened when Status Quo made a record with some Beach Boys, which was a version of Fun, 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 which was execrable. I mean, honestly, it's just a terrible record in every conceivable
Worse than
way.
Free, I haven't heard, is it worse than Free as a Bird? Free as a Bird's, I mean, I had a really good, Bob Rivers did a song parody and it was called This Song is Turd.
Yeah, well, you got it. So both of those records, it wasn't that we banned them, we just didn't play them.
Just decided that they didn't
It was,
fit.
as I used to say at the time, we haven't banned Beethoven.
Yeah.
We haven't banned South Pacific, but we're not actually playing them on Radio 1. But people like to make mischief, don't they?
Something else that's been talked about a lot is Matthew Bannister brought in Chris Evans,
Yeah.
who at the time was a radio guy, but he was a huge TV star. TV shows like Don't Forget Your Toothbrush, and also a breakfast TV show called The Big Breakfast. And from what I've read, you and him didn't hit it off.
Well, I had loved Chris, and I'd been instrumental with Matthew in bringing him into GLR, and we were, reasonably, we're not buddies, but we got on all right. I was a huge admirer of his. When he arrived at Radio 1, Matthew made a mistake, and I think he's admitted it since, and it's never been done again. He let this major show become an independent production. And I had an impossible job, which is I was meant to be in charge of the music, and Chris and Dan McGrath, who was the producer, would not do what I said. So I would say, it doesn't really fit, guys, that you're playing, I don't know, the Shadows. I love the Shadows too, but, we're trying to make some changes here to Radio 1 and just play a slightly younger playlist. And they wouldn't do it. And I got attacked on air by Chris, and that wasn't very nice. And Matthew defended Chris, and then of course, as you would expect, a couple of months later, Chris then started having a go at Matthew himself, and it collapsed into there was some very bad behaviour, really, but it was
on Chris's part.
Yeah, but it was structurally wrong. Matthew had
Are
cleared.
you happy with the way you handled it? Because you must have been under an intense amount of pressure, because the press were ready. I mean, the press was siding with Chris Evans.
They
it seemed
were.
at first.
I wasn't seen as being anything other than that rather old guy who was making difficulties for them, which was ironic, given that, a little while earlier I'd been seen as the kind of the new broom who's sweeping all this stuff away. Suddenly I was the voice of the establishment, and I was constraining this great young talent. And that wasn't very pleasant, really. In subsequent years, I've become an independent producer, and so I know what it's like to pitch stuff to the BBC and to be an outsider and to feel that sometimes the BBC commissioners favour the BBC in-house people. But I can tell you, when you're in charge of the in-house people, particularly in that era, you didn't feel that at all. You felt like all our crown jewels, like The Breakfast Show, for goodness sake, are being given away. And it's very hard to keep the motivation of your own staff when they're saying to you, well, I'm thinking of going and working for another company. Why should I stay inside the BBC? Because we're not winning the business anymore. And in those days of the internal market, it was very hard. And it pitched us against one another. And so, as I say, I had this role where on the one hand, I was meant to be Chris's competitor for business. Mm-hmm. But on the other hand, I was meant to be his superior in terms of what they were allowed to do on the show. And it was an impossible thing to do. We've all got over it since.
So you still talk to Chris? So you're fine?
I mean, I don't go down the pub with him, but no, we're fine. And I've subsequently seen Matthew many times, and we've gone over this world. And when we have longer, I'll tell you more about that.
Okay. Well, maybe we'll do a subsequent interview a little bit further down the line. In 96...
Is anyone still listening to this?
In 96, you were appointed head of BBC Music Entertainment, running all of the BBC's pop music production, radio, TV, including Radios 1, 2, Top of the Pops, later with Jules Holland, Glastonbury. That sounds like the ultimate gig that someone like you would like.
Yeah. Well, you know, Graham, it was brilliant.
Why didn't it last?
Didn't last because Greg Dyke arrived and said, I can't understand why they're running radio and television together. Doesn't make any sense to me. We'll split them up again. And I met him subsequently and said, why did you do that? And he said, well, Jenny Abramsky said it was a good idea. He said, I couldn't see there was any value in it. And I said, but you never gave me, Greg, a chance to say what's brilliant, what has made Glastonbury happen is that radio and television are working together. And if you split them up, you won't be able to deliver that kind of stuff in the future. And he looked, I remember, because I was actually interviewing him at the time, and he looked at me and he said, well, that's absolutely right. I don't know why I did that. And it was insane.
Should you have been more forceful then?
Probably.
Yeah.
But at the time, so anyway, what they did was they said, okay, well, you've lost all your radio, but now you can be head of music entertainment television. I thought, well, I don't want to do that because as I said to you before, I'm not very good at it and I don't really want to do it. So as we're doing this interview in my house, that over there, that's the Greg Dyke wing.
Okay. So
if you get my
meaning. So there was some advantage to the situation there.
Well, and I'd also been tapped up by EMAP,
who were a magazine publisher but owned a lot of local radio stations.
They had radio stations and they had some TV, cable television, satellite television, and they offered me this job called managing director of pop. And I thought at the time, this is going to be great because I can put to work some of the skills I've learnt from making radio and television and very early days of online working together. I can make that work in a commercial way. And, you know, people at the BBC would always accuse me of being a bit too commercially minded. Little did they know I was bloody useless at it because I could never, I mean, you guys, you've done commercial radio, so you know that the important thing is your Q3 forecast or your Q2 results. It's no good saying, I think we could make that show better, or I think we could make this magazine have better photographs or better writing if we paid more. That argument very rarely works in those kind of companies. The only thing that does it is, I found a way of cost cutting. Let's sack someone.
The game is played the way the game is scored.
Good, very good line.
Yeah. Okay. So that didn't work out eventually. That was at EMAP. And then you went and did all sorts of stuff. You wrote a best-selling book about Nick Drake.
I'm not sure it's best-selling.
Well, I just thought I'd add that to it, yeah.
My friend Rory McGrath once looked at a copy and said, oh, look, a rare unsigned copy.
Okay. It was about Nick Drake. Was that was that a passion project?
Yeah, it was really. Somebody I knew who worked in, what were they called? Sanctuary Records rang me up and said, I've just been at a board meeting where they've been discussing projects, including books, and they want to do a book about Nick Drake. They can't find anyone to do it. And I thought of you. And I genuinely did think, Graham, well, do you know what? I've done radio, I've done television, I've been a columnist for the Sunday Telegraph and the Times.
You studied history.
All this stuff, yeah. So I could do this. And Nick Drake made records I loved, and he went to the same college as me in Cambridge, and I thought, well, I could probably knock this off and it'd be quite fun. And it was a really good thing to do, and I enjoyed it hugely.
And these days, it's Trevor Dann's company. That's what keeps you busy these days. Tell me a little bit about that.
I also have a couple of voiceover agencies which pay the bills. I make programs for anybody who asks me. And so that means...
On either side of the Atlantic?
Yes. I can make programs for... No, what I was going to say was, I define myself as a program producer, but what I really do is pitch. That's my job. I do pitching. And most of the things I pitch don't get made.
What would the batting average be?
Oh, I should say 1 in 20.
Really?
Oh, it's really low.
Okay.
Really low. And that's because there's a massive oversupply, because so many people have left the BBC particularly and think, oh, right, well, I'll just be an indie now then. So the bar is quite low in terms of getting on. Now, I've done all right, you know, and look, there's some of my New York awards right up there.
Yeah, there's a whole cabinet full of them, yeah.
And, you know, I've done okay, and I've worked with some really good people who've helped me to win those things and to make some successful programmes. But I'm glad I have another way of earning a living, because it's not easy out there unless you're tooled up to be one of the big companies like Something Else, Wise Butter, TBI, who've got offices and lots of staff. But anyway, you know, we're comfy.
Okay, I think we've covered a lot. What are you most proud of?
In professional life, I'm most proud of GLR and Sounds of the 20th Century, which is the long version of 25 Years of Rock. I think they're better, actually, than the originals. And those are the two things. There's a third one, which, if you'll forgive me, I'm very proud of firing Bruno Brooks.
Why?
No, I once said that when I die, I wouldn't mind here lies the man who sacked Bruno Brooks on my... No, I'm joking, really, and of course I don't have any personal antipathy for him, but I used to talk about it at the time as being one of those things that you do that you know has enormous resonance throughout the UK. You know, my God, they've sacked Bruno Brooks, amazing, how did that happen? And I'm joking, but I think most of the things that I've done are about taking, when I have been able to or asked to do, big decisions.
Where do we find out more about Trevor Dann?
Well, I mean, do you know what? Somebody wrote to me just after Christmas this year saying, sorry it's been so late writing this, but I wanted to say how much I enjoyed your programme that you did on Radio Nottingham in 1977-78. He said it was a brilliant show, and it widened my musical horizons. And I've just got one question. On your final show, what was the fifth record from the end? Because I've never been able to find it. So I suppose I'm very proud of that too. And I'm TrevorDann.com. If you want to get on the old website, there's some shit on there.
And is it you and Trevor Horn, probably the two most famous Trevors in the world?
Oh, well, I don't think I'm famous. I think Trevor Nelson's more famous than I am.
Yeah, but as far as respected...
there's not a lot of Trevors. Do you know what? The only good thing about being a Trevor is that you never get a nickname. Whereas if you're called Dave or... You know,
because there are a lot of Daves. Yeah, you have to
be known by some other name,
so
but everybody just calls you Trevor. We should do.
Trevor Dann, let me
well,
shake your
thank you,
hand.
Graham.
That was terrific.
Privilege.
Thank you.